Likely as a result of the now, I guess, couple of weeks ago, part 2 of the LTT Linux Challenge 2026, where Linus complained about PopOS calling itself LTS when he felt like the project just wasn't really stable enough to use that term, thanks in large part to the still work in progress Cosmic Desktop. Recently, Nate Graham of KDE published this piece: long-term support LTS doesn't mean what you think. A lot of people, they will see these LTS distros, these LTS projects, and the project, they know what they are offering. They know how they are using LTS, what that actually means. But a lot of people, when they see the phrase LTS, there are expectations in their mind of what they're going to get that don't necessarily align with what is actually being offered. This is a topic that I've discussed a number of times, and frankly, I still think it's a really interesting conversation because I still think a lot of people are making the same mistakes over and over and over again. Now, they're probably new, different people, but every time you get a new group of people that are coming to Linux, they're making the same old mistakes. If you don't believe me, go and read the replies talking about the problems that Linus had with PopOS. Read the replies about everything Linus had a problem with, but notably the problems he had with PopOS, and you're going to see a lot of people pretty much agree with Linus's stance. This is calling it LTS. Why is it not LTS? I thought LTS meant it was going to be stable and bug-free, maybe not bug-free, but not very buggy and something that you can comfortably rely on. Now, we can theorize about what LTS could or should mean, but the best place to start is the way the projects are actually using it. From Debian stable, security updates are provided by Debian security team for 3 years. This generally means that each stable release is supported for its whole life, plus an extra year or so after a new version of stable is released. In addition, further security support is provided by the LTS and LTS extended projects. From Ubuntu, LTS stands for long-term support, which means 5 years of free security and maintenance updates. And from Kubuntu, which Ubuntu is based on, the latest long-term support LTS version of the Kubuntu operating system for desktops, PCs, and laptops, Kubuntu 2604, is supported with security and maintenance updates until April 2029. Now, OpenSUSE Leap is not included in this because whilst a lot of people do consider it to be an LTS, and it does functionally operate in a similar way to these other projects, they don't actually use the term themselves. That is also the case for RHEL. Instead, they opt for a phase kind of naming. You have a full support phase, you have maintenance support phase, and extended life phase. Each of these terms, because they are only being used by RHEL, can be well defined by RHEL, and you don't have this baggage of other projects and what you should be expecting based on your existing knowledge. As for PopOS, whilst they do use the term LTS, this is more of a borrowed term. They don't actually define their usage per se. This is basically saying PopOS is based off of Ubuntu 2404 LTS. The next version will be 2604 LTS. Frankly, I do think a lot of PopOS's problems could be resolved by just dropping this part of the name. You can mention somewhere in the documentation, oh, it is based off of Ubuntu 2404 LTS, but I do think a lot of the misunderstandings about what PopOS is and what they are providing is very much based off of the fact they do use the Ubuntu naming, let alone the fact that a lot of people do look at this and say, oh, it's based on Ubuntu 2404 LTS, so it must be really out of date because 2604 LTS is out now, whereas that's not actually really relevant to the way that PopOS does their release model. I think this just ends up creating a lot more confusion than it ends up helping. Putting that one to the side, these other operating systems are fairly consistent about what long-term support means to them. Each discrete OS release will continue receiving updates for a certain number of years. Might be 2 years, might be 3 years, might be 5 years, might be 10 years, depending on the way they're handling it. Those updates will include fixes for security issues. Those updates may include whatever maintenance means. Ubuntu and Ubuntu promise this, Debian doesn't say. Those updates will not include any new features, UI improvements, or other non-bug fix releases from the software's developers. That is to say, each piece of software is effectively locked to a specific version for the life of the release. So let's say you have browser version 70, and then, I don't know why I picked 70. Browser version 70. You wouldn't get any new UI changes, any new functionality improvements, anything else like that. But if there were any CVEs discovered, or any just really, even just basic security issues, those would be backported if they are relevant to that specific version. Whilst I like Pop! OS and whilst I like Cosmic, this is another part of the reason why I'm not exactly a fan of the LTS naming for Pop! OS, because the Cosmic Desktop, which is the thing that a user is primarily interacting with, that's not operating like an LTS system would, right? You're not waiting 6 months or a year to get the next version of Cosmic. You're getting it relatively quickly. It's in many ways sort of like I wouldn't call it a development environment for Cosmic, because it's not like nightly builds, but you are getting these updates at a relatively frequent pace. Some of those updates are going to be bad, and that is going to cause some problems. I think the usage of the term really depends on what do you care is acting like the LTS, right? Because in something like an Ubuntu LTS, the entire stack is. The desktop, the lower level components, the kernel, all of this is behaving in that LTS manner. But Pop! OS, it's generally considered to be like a semi-rolling system where you have these underlying components that might behave in this LTS way, but then things like the kernel, things like the desktop, GPU drivers, things like that, those are going to be moving at a far more frequent pace. As I've said in prior videos, it's not a bad model, but there is this mismatch of expectations when you compare it to other LTS systems out there, and even if you just compare it to the LTS system that Pop! OS itself is built on. Now, as for things that are not promised by an LTS, lack of bugs, lack of crashes, fixes for non-security issues, personal support for issues you encounter, and support for newer hardware devices. Ubuntu does offer hardware enablement kernels for desktop installs by default, but they are a separate thing from the LTS. They're not a guarantee of the LTS itself. LTS doesn't just mean that nothing besides the LTS can be done. You can have additional packages, additional add-ons to it as well, but those are not part of the LTS. And especially these first two here, a lot of people go to an LTS system with that being the expectation. Oh, there's going to be less bugs. Oh, there's going to be a lack of crashes, or there's going to be less crashes. And yes, in some ways that's possibly going to be true, but it's not something that is typically being offered by the LTS. There's sort of additional factors that lead into that happening. That doesn't mean an LTS release of Debian, Ubuntu, or Ubuntu will be devoid of these things. It just means they aren't promised. Probably you'll get a lot of them anyway, but there's no guarantee. You'll probably get fixes for non-security issues. You'll probably get support for newer hardware. You might even get personal support for your issues if you're not paying anything. Whether or not you're getting much of it is a whole nother story, but these are not things being promised by the LTS. I think this is where some of the persistent confusion around the LTS topic comes from. LTS releases are fairly reliable as long as you use the most popular software from their included software repositories, especially if you're using some of the bigger, more well-tested LTS releases. You'll typically have a fairly good experience. So in the circumstances when this stops being the case, I think sometimes people can feel betrayed. They think, I thought this was supposed to be stable. Why didn't anyone fix this bug yet? Where's my long-term support? But Debian, Ubuntu, and Ubuntu never promise any level of reliability or absence of bugs. they promised that the version lock software in their repos would receive security fixes for a certain number of years. Ubuntu and Kubuntu also offered a certain amount of non-guaranteed best-effort hardware compatibility improvements and non-security bug fixes. That's it. I think this right here is a big part of the confusion. People confuse version locked software with a lack of bugs. It's not a lack of bugs. What it is well-documented issues. Bugs are very likely not going to be fixed in this software unless they're bugs that are just critically breaking the application. In a lot of cases, you're just going to have to deal with the bugs that exist and then work around them. This is a big part of the reason why when you go and make a game, for example, you don't just go and randomly update your game engine. Typically, you start the game in a version and then you finish the game in that same version. Maybe if some big feature is added, you update to that version, but never past that point. Because you have a set version, you know the bugs that are in that version, the design issues you need to work around. When you go and update to a newer version, yes, some of your older bugs are going to be fixed, but now you have newer bugs to contend with, newer bugs which are very likely far less documented. But if you go into it with this mismatch of expectations thinking, oh, I'm on an LTS release, therefore LTS means that it is less buggy, means that it is more stable, you are going to be disappointed because that is not what you are getting. You don't build a server with an LTS release because it is more stable. You build it with an LTS release because you don't have to worry about things breaking from updates. And again, this is part of the reason why the LTS naming for Pop! OS does cause quite a few issues like this. If the goals of an LTS distro don't align with you, there are plenty of other options out there. For example, you want newer software. If you're a software developer or a technology enthusiast, you may want to get software on or closer to its developers' release schedules. This will give you a stream of new features, UI improvements, and fixes for bugs. In this case, the best option is a rapidly updating OS like Arch Linux, OpenSUSE Tumbleweed, Fedora KDE, or one of their children. Now, Fedora KDE is a point release, but they don't have an LTS system, so you're always expected to be on the latest release, and you tend to get these updates in a, relatively sane fashion. If you want something which is fast-moving and you don't want to deal with the problems of Arch Linux, I have heard very good things about OpenSUSE Tumbleweed. I am not a Tumbleweed user myself, so take that with a grain of salt, but typically problems that happen on Linux are either being discovered by the developers or being discovered by users on Arch Linux, because there's less testing being done on this distro than something like OpenSUSE. The trade-off here is you have to live with some things that are currently working getting broken after updating. In other words, the bugs are unstable, unlike an LTS release where the bugs are stable. Whilst that is true, also, the same can be said in reverse. When something is broken, you'll get the fix for it considerably faster as well. My recommendation is firstly, keep an LTS kernel around just in case you have kernel issues. Secondly, for any critical software, use an app image, use a Flatpak, use something outside of your distro packaging, and then you can easily control the version. Or just go and compile it if you really want to, but I don't particularly want to go and compile Kden Live, for example. I want fewer bugs. Don't we all? I think a lot of people choose an LTS OS to experience fewer bugs, but this is generally not a strength of the LTS product. When an LTS OS freezes on a specific set of software, all the bugs in those versions of the software are frozen too. Unless the LTS OS provider fixes any of those bugs themselves or backports fixes for them, users will be exposed to them for the lifetime of the release. With a rapidly updating operating system, when a software developer fixes bugs in their software, you'll get those bug fixes quickly. As long as the software itself is becoming less buggy over time, a rapidly updating operating system shipping software close to its developer's release schedule will likewise become less buggy over time. But it's going to feel buggier because they're new bugs that you don't know how to deal with, or they're new bugs that you now have to experience. There were probably bugs in the LTS version that you never came across because it didn't affect your hardware configuration, your software configuration, the way you use the software. You know, a feature that you don't actually use has a bug, but now in the newer version, that old bug is fixed. Maybe like 3 other bugs are fixed, but now something you actually use does have a bug. At the same time, if things are not getting better over time, a fast pace of change means more opportunities for those developers to accidentally introduce new bugs, and also for the introduction of integration issues, bugs caused by software being misconfigured or incompatible with other software. LTS OSs excel at minimizing integration issues between software because a frozen set of software isn't a moving target for QA testing. A frozen set of software is easy to target because nothing is changing. Really, the only way to have less bugs is 1, using software which is well developed and well testing, which involves actually doing research on the software you are using, and 2, touch grass. There's no bugs in the grass. Oh, there are bugs, but different kinds of bugs. I want better hardware support. If the manufacturer of your device didn't provide much in the way of Linux software support, a rapidly updating operating system is likewise a better option here. You'll quickly get all the components that improve hardware support, not just the parts in the kernel. Also, if you're relying on a lot of third-party development, for example, with a racing wheel, there's actually pretty good racing wheel support on Linux, but it's all coming from like random developers doing their own thing. You're likely going to want to be on something that is more fast-moving, a more rolling system, so if anything does change, then you can bring in those updates as quickly as possible. Another example, my mouse here, the, what do we have here? Some Corsair thing. Corsair Scimitar RGB, I think is what it is. This specific version of it, older versions of it were fine, but this specific version does not actually have support in Corsair CFG, the like third-party Corsair configuration tool, but there is a PR open for it. So when that gets merged and when a new version gets released with it, I can actually configure this on Linux and not have to do it in a Windows virtual machine. I want a true reliability guarantee. I want something that is going to crash less, that is going to have less bugs, that I can get support for. You better start paying then, because that's the only way that is really going to happen. You will need to pay a commercially supported operating system, or I guess, I don't know, like hire your own developer butler. I don't know. For example, Canonical offers Ubuntu Pro with a level of support that includes the following. Build with confidence with 24/7 365 phone and ticket support. Get prompt help when something breaks on any of the packages in the Ubuntu main and universe repositories, which is a lot of packages, including the most widely used open source applications and toolchains. Our 24/7 plans include SLAs not only for initial response times, but also for ongoing follow-up updates, ensuring continuous visibility and faster remediation throughout the life cycle of your support case, and that is about $300 per year for workstations, which is actually, if you need your system to be stable, not actually that crazy. For servers, it's far more expensive, but like that's a price that is worth paying. Is it worth paying for you as a regular desktop user who is possibly not even using your system to make money with Linux? Probably not. But if you are, you know, some big open source developer that relies on your system being stable, maybe it is. Red Hat and SUSE also offer similar things, and pretty much every commercial distro offers something of this vein. If time is money, those prices may look pretty reasonable. Same reason why people pay lots and lots of money for Adobe Photoshop, right? You as a regular user look at Photoshop and say, that is a ludicrous price, why would anyone pay that? If you work in a job where you're making money with it, paying money for your tools is not anywhere near as big of a concern, especially in cases where your job is likely also paying for it as well. What about Flatpak and Snap? We cannot forget the app images. In principle, these technologies allow an LTS-style OS to offer the best of both worlds, a stable base with apps updating more rapidly. And this is a model that is being played around with by some of these systems. They're not necessarily using the term LTS, but this is being tried. In practice, what you get is a mixing of both worlds. The base OS retains its LTS characteristics, while apps become rapidly updating, giving you some exposure to breakage coming from new versions alongside more features, UI improvements, and fixes for existing bugs. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with having some parts of the system be fast moving. Again, if you want to have an LTS release and then maybe you want to have your video editor or your browser or something else like that always be on the latest version, this does offer a way to do that. But I do think there is, whilst it's being experimented with, I do think there's something to be said about having an LTS system that has all of these apps that are frequently updating. Again, it creates this weird kind of model like PopOS has where it's calling itself LTS, but it is not the LTS that people would typically know. But let me know, what do you run? Do you run an LTS system? Do you run a rolling release? Do you run a semi-rolling release like PopOS or something else? Maybe a regular or point release like a Fedora? I would love to know. And what is your perception of an LTS release? What do you expect to get from it? And do you expect it to be a system that is more stable, or just the fact that it's something which is a point in time that you understand? I would love to know. So, if you liked the video, go like the video, go subscribe as well, and if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribes, Daily Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. That's gonna be it for me, and LCD.